Thousands of protesters storm government buildings in Brazil in opposition to the president. President Biden's lawyers find several classified documents in his former personal office. A lawsuit against the Biden administration reveals that the White House coerced Facebook to suppress their political foes. And now that we finally have a speaker, what is the House of Representatives going to do? I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Welcome, friends. It is January 11th, 2022, and let me tell you, it is raining cats and dogs here in Los Angeles. I'm sure you have heard on the news about the extreme weather that we are experiencing, and it is really all that it is being cracked up to be. We know that there are at least 14 people who have died. There's one 5-year-old who's missing. 100,000 trees have gone down, and Southern California is just in a state of shock because we are pretty lucky and privileged when it comes to weather. So this has hit us literally pretty hard. But I'm very happy to be here with you today. Didn't know if I was going to be able to drive safely, but we made it. So let's get right to the stories that you need to know today. Turning our attention to Brazil. Thousands of Brazilians wearing the national colors of green and yellow stormed the Supreme Court, the Congressional Building, and the Presidential Palace yesterday, calling for Brazil's current left-wing president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, to be removed from office. These individuals are supporters of the former Brazilian president, a right-winger named Jair Bolsonaro, who lost to Lula in the presidential election last year by the closest margin in the history of Brazilian presidential elections. Pro-Bolsonaro supporters are claiming that the election was stolen from Bolsonaro, that there were problems with ballot counting machines, and Bolsonaro himself has not yet publicly conceded the election. He left the country shortly before Lula's inauguration and obviously did not attend the inauguration ceremony. And on social media, he still calls himself the president of Brazil. He did condemn the attacks yesterday, though, tweeting that, quote, peaceful demonstrations within the law are part of democracy. However, vandalism and the invasion of public buildings like today's acts and those practiced by the left in 2013 and 2017 are an exception. Like other Latin American countries, Brazil has a reputation for being quite corrupt. It was under a military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985, and this is not the first time that there have been anti-government protests, and specifically, this is not the first time that there has been a storming of government buildings. For instance, as recently as 2017, left-wing rioters stormed the Ministry of Agriculture building in an anti-government protest. Here to talk with me about Brazil is Mateo Haydar, an expert on Latin America from the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. So let's start off talking a bit about Brazil's history. Could you give us a bit of a crash course or a bit of a primer on the history of Brazil? I know that it was a Portuguese colony and it gained its independence in the 19th century. But what has gone on in broad terms from the time of its independence to today that has caused such turmoil?
Yes, Julie. So you laid that out perfectly there. It's been busy since the colonial period, but basically, a few key things to keep in mind here. Brazil was once an empire. Even I mean, it's been historically because of its size and its position in the region. Economically, in terms of resources and its history, as a regional power in South America, it's been well positioned, really as one of the few countries with a regional and global projection in Latin America, and you had the period of the military dictatorship. You have even preceding that, and in fact leading up to that period, you've had historic patterns of corruption like most other countries in Latin America. So there's no rarity there. And what you saw, and what's key to know now, at least for the period that we're going through and that we're looking at here stateside, is that Brazil, in its military dictatorship period, obviously, a lot of controversy and turmoil from that. Bred also, a leftist movement that was born from that. That Lula, as a union leader at the time, and a charismatic figure, for years, before he was elected to anything, embodied, and finally, after three election cycles, finally gained power in 2002. This was on a wave of leftist victories throughout Latin America, which we had never seen. And what we're seeing now is a return of that, and with much more potent force. Lula, it should be remembered that it's worth mentioning, he was the founder with Fidel Castro, the Cuban dictator, of the Sao Paulo Forum, which was a radical leftist and is a radical leftist organizing mechanism for electoral strategies, or for the electoral strategy of the regional left, right? And so after the Cold War, Soviet-backed guerrilla groups realized that they weren't able to achieve power through arms, and they regrouped and decided that it was time to pursue electoral victories. And that's what they did. It brought you Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in 1998, which Lula has been a historic ally of. Ortega in Nicaragua, which Lula was defending just this campaign. And so that's his camp and his corner. And so there's obvious frustration around that. Lula governed for 2 terms. Obviously, Brazil is a massive country, and it's a lot more complicated for the left in a country like that than in a smaller Latin American country. But no doubt, I mean, this was a president who found himself in that camp, a historic ally, which we can talk about, Julie, in a bit, of China, Russia, and Iran, as well as his regional friends. He presided over, most importantly, I think for what we're seeing in the last few days, he presided over the most significant corruption scandals in Brazilian history, which led to his trial and conviction in 2017. He spent 580 days in prison. So this is a convicted criminal at the end of the day. And those funds that were embezzled basically out of Brazilian state coffers were then used to fund the organized left across the region, and including those dictators that I mentioned in Cuba and Venezuela and others. And so this is someone who is very controversial. He was released from prison, but never exonerated. He was released on procedural grounds, basically. And what we're seeing now is that polarization and frustration manifest until, unfortunately, it led to a violent turn on Sunday.
So, given Lula's corruption, do the pro Bolsonaro rioters or protesters of the past 2 days have any legitimate claims about what happened in the 2022 election? They are quite fervent in their belief that it was stolen.
Yeah. So, one thing to note here is that this is a highly decentralized process. So what we're seeing is different groups within the Bolsonaro camp, different groups of supporters, not led necessarily by Bolsonaro himself or by any one high-level figure, but dispersed groups, and we can talk about those different trends within the movement that you're seeing, have been raising these claims, which, of course, Bolsonaro also spent months ahead of the election raising concerns primarily about Brazil's digital voting system, right, which is completely digitalized, unlike the United States. It's completely centralized, unlike the United States. And so what you see there is concerns, for example, that there's no manual count, right? And so there's no way to verify uh, the outcome, which is also unlike the U.S., with its pros and its cons. They count in just minutes. Yeah, they'll have an election result, which is impressive, but that leads to concerns about the validity of the results, and which is what they have been pointing to. You also see concerns primarily with censorship and free speech violations during the campaign, specifically against conservatives and against the Bolsonaro camp, from the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, which is basically the electoral commission that presides over election races. And so, also, by the way, filled with Lula and Lula ally appointed figures. And so, you saw there a bias that conservatives were pointing to. And then you also saw concerns more broadly, and again, in a very decentralized way at the local level, with potential voter fraud or vote buying, which is, again, not atypical to any country in the region. Um, but this is kind of the agglomeration of the concerns that have been raised. And they're asking for some kind of response mechanism to those concerns. And I think more than that, Julie, what you're seeing is exasperation, fear that Lula and the weaponization of corruption that you saw in Lula's first two terms will return, and with potentially devastating consequences for Brazil's democratic institutions.
What you outlined is not unlike the grievances that American conservatives have here in this country. So you mentioned a few minutes ago that there has been this phenomenon in Latin America of people increasingly electing left-wing leaders. They've called it the pink wave. It's happened in Venezuela, in Chile, and of course in Brazil with Lula. Why do you think there has been that trend towards the left?
Well, there's a couple things going on here that I think are um, important for the American public for us to keep in mind as Americans when looking at our closest neighbors. One is, I mean, you're seeing the broader trends that you see everywhere of issues with corruption, of issues with poverty, and whenever there's some kind of crisis economically, for example, you saw with COVID, that was kind of exacerbating a lot of the economic trends that have kind of laid fertile ground for the left to weaponize in a lot of these countries. And then the second point is that the left is weaponizing these conditions in a lot of these countries. And again, in a phenomenon that is not distant or unrelated to the character of Lula himself. Again, this is if you look at the leaders that have been elected in the region, they're not leaders even that you could identify with the left in the United States necessarily, even though they have many sympathies among the left in the United States. But these are leaders of a radical bent. These are many leaders who came from the Cold War era. Many of them were former guerrilla leaders or former movement or union leaders that were linked to radical groups, in some cases linked to the Soviet Union, and others backed by the Soviets, again, during the Cold War. And what you saw is that these groups, backed directly by Fidel Castro and in close alliance with Lula and others, as I mentioned, in the 1990s, they regrouped, and they are a network today. They have basically gained, they've made gains all over the region, which is unprecedented. Even you had the first pink tide in the 2000s, but now, for the first time ever, every major economy in the region will be governed by the left. And again, this network, when you have leaders that in some cases are democratically elected, But they turn and are uh, supporting and making excuses for dictators in Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela when they have a history of channeling state funds of a sovereign country to fund a repressive dictatorship nearby. That points to a different kind of phenomenon, which is what you're seeing. And then I think the last element, Julie, to keep in mind is that the United States has overlooked the threat and the challenge uh, that we face as a country when our closest neighbors are potentially turning into client states for bigger powers that be, meaning China, Russia, and Iran, which have grown their threat networks within our hemisphere, which is unprecedented. They're competing in every sphere, from the media to strategic economic sectors and others that the United States has completely abandoned. We're instead more focused on uh, climate change or projects that have more to do through foreign aid, for example, that have more to do with our domestic or the domestic political interests of some, uh, in this case on the left with the Biden administration, unfortunately.
Pronouns.
And
We care more about pronouns.
exactly, and you see that. I mean, it's unbelievable when you look closely at some of our engagements with our closest partners, which are, by the way, conservative at their core. Right? These are highly religious countries. These are countries that what they care about is their families and their pocketbooks. Right? And there's every reason for us to be engaging to compete to make sure that these countries don't turn into client states for communist China. And unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing.
Mhm. So, what are some specific ways under Lula that Brazil may be becoming, in your terms, a client state of China, Russia, or Iran?
Yeah. So, and it really, unfortunately, at this point, it goes beyond Lula. Lula opened the door to China in the early 2000s. He benefited from a global commodities boom that China was basically driving by buying whatever it could from a country like Brazil. And so that allowed Lula the resources to mobilize his domestic agenda. But since then, you've seen China make important inroads. In fact, even under Bolsonaro, we need to keep in mind that the Bolsonaro government came in wanting to put limits uh, on China's gains, right, and to push back on China in sectors like 5G with Huawei, which already has projects in Brazil. And they were unable to do so. They basically found no alternative. We were unable to present a clear alternative in many of these sectors, and they also found an aggressive China lobby in Brazil already, and so they're already there. They have huge stakes, for example, in media. They have publishing companies tied directly to the Chinese Communist Party in
Mm.
Brazil, and so this is not any kind of hyperbole. I mean, they play in almost every sector uh, that we aren't necessarily competing in, and presenting either a U.S. alternative or an alternative that's friendly to us through one of our partners. And so you're likely to see that grow under Lula. The Biden administration is making the mistake of um, thinking and implying and even asserting in some cases that by making gestures to Lula and by aligning themselves on cosmetic uh, matters or on again by being friendly, that they will be able to undo Lula's record uh, of again of long-standing ties and already clear indication that he will expand ties with China and with others. And we have no strategy. I think that's the bottom line, that we have no strategy.
Let's talk a little bit about Bolsonaro. He famously said that he wanted to bring back the military dictatorship in Brazil that happened from 1964 to 1985. What threat may Bolsonaro pose to democracy in Brazil?
Look, Bolsonaro is a controversial figure, no doubt, in Brazil and in the international media. He's made comments in the past that are controversial, but his record and his actions show that he governed like a mainstream right of center uh, leader democratically elected in the region. And he raised concerns for uh, again for years, really. I mean, if you look at a longer record of concerns about Brazil's digital voting system, and the media basically they took that and they weaponized that. The Biden administration was not impartial in that conversation. When Lula was basically beating the drum on this as a sensitive point in the campaign to basically say Bolsonaro is undemocratic, the White House was issuing statements in the heat of the race, saying that they would recognize the results immediately, and that basically implying that there was a problem here in terms of Bolsonaro not recognizing the results, and then again deciding to comment on it. Bolsonaro raised those concerns, and then when he lost the election, he decided to recognize or basically accept the transition. And so he didn't get in the way of any transition from occurring. He continues to raise those concerns, which are his to raise. And then uh, more recently, he's been repeatedly clarifying, as you mentioned earlier, Julie, that violence is not acceptable here, and that there's a difference between peaceful protest and violence. And so he's been outright. And what you're seeing from the Lula camp is trying to pin this directly on Bolsonaro and on his closest allies. The fear there is that they may use this to crack down on opponents and to erode aspects of the democratic framework that he'll operate in.
It's amazing how much we hear about Bolsonaro's controversies in the American media, but we don't hear that much about Lula and his history of corruption and his ties to dictatorships. It's just stunning, but unfortunately not surprising. Now, finally, to ask you the obvious question, what is next for Brazil? Do you think that there's any hope that they can reach a kind of peace or a stable democracy?
Yeah, I think right now, I mean, this turbulence, as you mentioned, Julie, is not new. You saw protests that also turned violent from the left, by the way, in 2013 and 2017. The polarization that you're seeing is real, and it is deep rooted, and it is likely to continue. The question now is, where does Lula go from here? He's in a very strong position internationally after this week. It should be recognized because of the world's rallying behind him, rightfully condemning any kind of political violence. But there's implications for that in terms of how they're rallying for Lula standing internationally. And the concern is again that he doesn't use this moment to further consolidate domestically against democratically elected conservative opponents. And so that is a concern. There's also a regional aspect to this, Julie. One, again, for the reasons that I mentioned with China. The other is that if you look at the inconsistencies here, for example, with how the Biden administration dealt this week with this kind of political violence from the right, and just a month ago, when a leftist president in Peru attempted a coup against his own Congress, they were radio silent, and President Biden himself made no statement. They waited, and they publicly admitted to this actually, to having waited on making any kind of statement from the State Department, for example, until um, other presidents in the region and elsewhere spoke. And so the concerns there about the wave of the left in the region, the turmoil that we've seen in other countries, that's not going away necessarily anytime soon. And what the U.S. needs is a strategy to uh, push back on China, to support civil society groups that keep these governments accountable. And so we need to be having that conversation instead, and see how we can apply it to a long-term, engagement with Brazil and with other countries. Expect more turmoil in Brazil to follow. These protests are ongoing. They're not just in Brasilia, but in Sao Paulo and in other major cities. So this has gone national. You're seeing at the same time a divide there between the federal police that Lula has deployed and aspects of the military, for example, that have had more resistance toward Lula, just because of their nature historically. Lula actually publicly made statements this week condemning military officers for not for cooperating with protesters. There was accusations that there were units that were enabling the protesters in some cases. And what you're seeing is a struggle that Lula has for control of the military, and more concerningly, a, a basically a push within the military to politicize aspects of it. And so the latest news with that is this week you saw 6,000 military officers, Julie, purged from the Brazilian military, what Lula is calling the de-Bolsonarization. And so this is going to continue. We shouldn't get caught up in the media narratives about comparing it to January 6th or to one thing or another, or to the events just of this week alone. We need to be looking at where we go from here, where Lula goes from here, and what the Biden administration is doing about it.
We both know that violence is never okay, but it is just incredible to see this worldwide trend of discrimination against conservatives, not just here in the United States, not just in Brazil, but across countries in Europe. Hungary comes to mind, Denmark comes to mind. It seems to be a global trend. And the United States is stoking this radical leftism in Brazil, playing right into the hands of China, Russia, and Iran, supposedly our adversaries, but we are helping them. Matteo Haydar, thank you so much for coming on to Timeless, especially last minute as this Brazil news emerged. It's been great to speak with you.
Great to speak with you, Julie. Thanks so much for having me.
Let me tell you about Monorail, America's investment app that takes you from where you are financially to where you want to be. Monorail is an investment and savings app. It doesn't matter whether you're an Apple fan or if you prefer Android, Monorail is available in both environments and online at monorail.com. Monorail is safer for users with bank-level encryption and biometrics. Your money is protected with Monorail through the Securities Investor Protection Corporation and the FDIC. No matter how you engage with Monorail, you're getting the security and safety that you need. Whether you're adding funds to your investment account, looking to buy a stock, or putting money aside for future purchases. With Monorail, you can put your money where it matters and utilize the economic power that has built this country. So don't go somewhere else to trade stocks. Monorail gives you the freedom to purchase whole or fractional shares in companies that you believe in. It only takes 5 minutes to download the app and to set it up. Join the pro-America money movement. Join Monorail. Our next story is that President Biden's lawyers found a small number of classified documents that Biden left at his personal office at a Washington think tank during the time that he served as vice president. According to the White House, the files were found by Biden's personal lawyers in November of last year, November 2nd to be exact, while they were packing boxes for him at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. By the way, extra points to people who knew that then Vice President Biden had a think tank. I don't mean this to be snide. It's a genuine question. Do other vice presidents have think tanks? And if so, what's the purpose of those think tanks? Isn't the vice president supposed to be running our country instead of working at or running a think tank? The Justice Department has said that it is investigating this situation, while simultaneously the DOJ has appointed a special counsel to investigate President Trump's possession of classified documents. It is true that President Trump is alleged to have had far more documents in his possession than were discovered at Biden's think tank. But let's listen to what President Biden said just a few months ago after the FBI's raid on Mar-a-Lago.
When you saw the photograph of the top secret documents laid out on the floor at Mar-a-Lago, what did you think to yourself, looking at that image?
How that could possibly happen, how anyone could be that irresponsible. And I thought, what data was in there that may compromise sources and methods? By that I mean names of people who helped, or et cetera. And it's just totally irresponsible.
There's no point in belaboring this story. We all know it's hypocritical. The Democrats yawned when Hillary Clinton was discovered to have used a private email server while she was Secretary of State to send classified government material. But the FBI raided Trump's estate and not Clinton's house. President Biden admonished Trump when he did the same thing. We get it. It does seem, though, that the mainstream media is talking about this story a lot. Last night, I turned on CNN as I was running on the treadmill. See, by the way, my nice way of sneaking in that I work out. I was on the treadmill and I was watching CNN, and they just kept going on and repeating and covering this story, and I was a bit shocked. But then I realized it is as clear as day what they are doing. What they are trying to do is throw a bone to the right and to the American people, since this is a pretty minor offense on the scale of Biden offenses. And they're trying to show we're impartial. We reported on President Biden holding classified materials improperly. See, we're fair to both sides. We just don't go after President Trump alone. But given how the far more egregious stuff pertaining to President Biden they do not discuss, we're not falling for their little ruse here. The vastly more important story today concerning President Biden and his administration, and of course, one that the mainstream media is choosing to shoo under the rug, is this. Last year, the attorney generals of Missouri and Louisiana filed a joint lawsuit against the Biden administration, alleging that the White House worked with social media companies to censor political content, and specifically anti-COVID vaccine content that the administration did not like. 4 plaintiffs, including 2 epidemiologists who were censored for saying that children and adults with natural immunity from COVID don't need vaccines, also joined the attorney generals of Missouri and Louisiana in the case. So back in February of 2021, shortly after President Biden's inauguration, Facebook announced that it was going to decrease political content in its news feeds. They also said that they would try to, quote, rank political content in people's news feeds using different signals. And then again, in July of this past year, in 2022, just before our midterm elections, Facebook reaffirmed this announcement to the American people that they would decrease political content. What we know now, though, thanks to documents that have just been released in this Missouri versus Biden case, what we know is that the Biden administration officials made Facebook do that, and that these Biden administration officials were controlling what political information and news that Facebook was choosing to put out for its users. The Biden White House director of digital media named Rob Flaherty was one of the key members of the administration who was communicating directly with Facebook and YouTube, which is owned by Google, and was harshly demanding that they censor people who expressed skepticism about the COVID vaccine on their platforms. Before I get into the specifics here of the email exchanges between Rob Flaherty and people at Facebook, there are 2 points that are critically important for us to remember as we look at this story. First, it is totally legitimate and rooted in fact, and yes, rooted in science, to question the COVID vaccine. I reported on this last week in the episode called Vaccine Speculation, so I'm not going to get into too much detail. You can go back and watch that episode. But I will tell you that a lot of information has come out, such as the fact that the FDA and the World Health Organization both updated their information on COVID vaccines to acknowledge the risk of myocarditis, which is the inflammation of the heart, which can lead to heart failure and heart attacks. The FDA also recently announced that the COVID-19 vaccine has been linked to blood clotting in older individuals. There's also been, as many of us know, a sizable number of sudden deaths or health events that have occurred in otherwise healthy individuals over the past 2 years that has caused many of us to scratch our heads. The most prominent example is that the 17-year-old daughter of U.S. House of Representatives Congressman from Illinois, Sean Casten, died in her sleep of heart arrhythmia. It was also announced on December 23rd that ABC News producer Dax Tejera died suddenly of a heart attack at age 37. And Stanford health professor Michelle Mello's 45-year-old husband suddenly had a stroke just a few days after his second dose of the COVID vaccines. We also know that the original COVID vaccines, when they were rolled out, had only been tested for 10 months, when the usual length of time for vaccine trials is 10 years. And boosters, when they were rolled out, were never tested in human beings, only in 8 mice. The CDC finally has also released data in recent months that more people have died who are vaccinated than unvaccinated. So all of this is just to say, people who are raising speculation about the COVID vaccine or people who may not feel comfortable getting the COVID vaccine are totally within their right. And again, this is rooted in facts. It's not fiction. And the second important thing to remember here is that the First Amendment prohibits the government from abridging freedom of speech. So if the White House is working with Facebook to censor COVID content, or if the FBI is working with Twitter, as we know from the Twitter files, to censor damning information about the Bidens, that is a blatant violation of the First Amendment, and it is legally and perhaps criminally actionable. And even if every single piece of vaccine skepticism was not rooted in truth, which again we know is not the case, it is rooted in truth, it is still against our Bill of Rights for the government to censor it. They are not allowed to censor any speech, even if that speech may be false. So let's look at some of these email exchanges that were released as a result of these documents in the Missouri versus Biden case. Again, this is between Rob Flaherty, who runs digital communications for the Biden White House, and executives at Facebook. In March of 2021, Mr. Flaherty emailed an exec at Facebook, whose name has not been revealed, saying that, quote, "We are gravely concerned," we is referring to the Biden administration, "we are gravely concerned that your service is one of the top drivers of vaccine hesitancy, period. We want to know," Flaherty writes, "that you are not playing a shell game." A shell game is a political game. In another email, Mr. Flaherty condemned Facebook for, quote, "directing attention to COVID skeptics and to anti-vaccine trusted messengers," and for, quote, "promoting anti-vaccine pages in its search." So the Facebook executive, as he did in many other emails, dutifully replied to Rob Flaherty and said that Facebook has pledged to, quote, "remove vaccine misinformation." But what's crucial here is that this Facebook executive also said that Facebook is pledging to, quote, reduce the virality of content discouraging vaccines that does not contain actionable misinformation. This executive admitted that some of this content is, quote, often true, but it can be, quote, alarmist or shocking. And so Facebook has pledged to remove the groups that circulate this sensational material. What an unbelievable admission. Facebook is admitting that they are censoring true material just because they don't like it. And the Biden administration has been pushing them to do that. Mr. Flaherty also demanded in his correspondences that Facebook, quote, limit the spread of viral content on WhatsApp, given WhatsApp's reach in immigrant communities and communities of color. Now, notice again that Mr. Flaherty here does not say that any of this content is untrue. He just doesn't want it out there, and Facebook capitulated. Mr. Flaherty also wrote to a Facebook executive telling him that the January 6th attack on the Capitol was, quote, plotted in large part by your platform. So he's trying to guilt Facebook by blaming January 6th on the platform. And Mr. Flaherty said that he wants assurances that Facebook would continue to, quote, deploy an algorithmic shift that promoted quality news and information about the election. Now, who's deciding what constitutes quality news about the election? Well, the Biden administration is. And finally, Flaherty wrote to Facebook flagging a Tucker Carlson episode for which the executive said that he was taking it down. And Flaherty also flagged the accounts of several private American citizens, which the Facebook executive responded, both of these accounts have been removed from Instagram entirely for breaking our policy. We also know from this trove of information released by the Missouri and Louisiana attorney generals, who, by the way, are heroes. I love them. Thank you for doing this. We know from these files that Twitter had meetings with top White House officials on vaccine information, so it wasn't just Facebook, but Twitter too. We also know that the Biden administration begged Facebook to take down a parody account of Dr. Fauci, and they did. So here's what this story, alongside so many other stories that are unfortunately coming out about the deep left-wing corruption, here's what this story reveals. People are saying right now that as a country, we are fracturing into blue and red. But the more accurate way of characterizing the dividing line is not between blue and red. It's between people who get it and people who don't get it. There are going to be individuals on the left who call this latest trove of documents a snooze fest, as the Rolling Stone called the Twitter files, or who say, governments do this all the time, it's not a big deal. But then there are those of us who really get what's happening. And what's happening is that the American elite is trying to create a two-tiered system where they set the rules and where the rest of us, we bigot conservatives, are their peons. We're not treated equally. We don't get to exchange our ideas freely. And let's look at some of the evidence. Number one, schools. In schools, they are promoting left-wing information about gender fluidity, critical race theory, this idea that America is a deeply racist place to confuse and indoctrinate children. And in schools, they make uncomfortable or even ridicule and harass students with conservative beliefs, bullying them into submission and silence. The evidence is also found in the disparagement of religion in this country. That football coach, whose case famously got all the way to the Supreme Court, who was fired from his high school for praying on the football field. Or the story of Diane Loud, who was a UN Human Rights Commissioner who freaked out over the Dedham, Massachusetts library displaying a Christmas tree. Or this Supreme Court case that we're seeing where a website designer was sued for not wanting to make a cake for a gay couple. Another piece of evidence is the way that the Department of Justice has far more prosecutions of January 6ers than BLMers. And they are allowing January 6ers, such as John Mellis, to rot in prison, not have a court date. They are subjecting people like John Mellis to solitary confinement and regular beatings in prison because they disagree with his politics. And we see that Merrick Garland is going after pro-life people for the simple offense of praying in front of abortion clinics. And now, the biggest piece of evidence is that the White House and the FBI and the DOJ are actively working together to suppress the free flow of information in favor of what they view as politically advantageous to them. So yes, there is a two-tiered system being created in this country. And when people hear me say this, I'm sure they're going to say how sensationalist, how over-exaggerated, and with respect, I would like to say to those individuals, you are blindfolding yourselves. You don't want to see what is really going on in this country because it is easier for you to operate and exist in a world where you deny that these egregious miscarriages of justice against conservatives are happening. And that is cowardice. Luckily, there are some members of the newly Republican majority House of Representatives who seem to not display cowardice and do seem to understand what is really going on. Now that we finally have a Speaker of the House Republicans have set their agenda for what they intend to accomplish. So as our final story for the day, let's look through 3 of the top action items that our taxpayer money, let us not forget, is going towards. First, as Timeless reported yesterday, a new committee will replace the January 6th committee that the House previously oversaw. And this new committee will investigate the weaponization of the government and especially the FBI against its political foes. That is great. Second, the House has agreed to vote to rescind tens of billions of dollars that the Biden White House secured last year to give to the IRS. This seems like a big victory, and it should be, but unfortunately, this will not pass the Democrat-run Senate. The House will vote to rescind this funding, but the Senate will knock it down. The background here of this IRS scandal is that in 2022, the Biden administration secured funding and authorization from the then Democratic House of Representatives to add 87,000 IRS agents over the next couple of years. The stated purpose is plain old revenue enhancement, to increase the ability of the IRS to audit the very wealthy and corporations to make sure that they are complying with our tax code. That's what President Biden says is the need for these IRS agents. But the historical evidence actually shows that audits tend to fall most not on the rich, but on people of lower incomes, and certainly people of lower incomes cannot hire lawyers and accountants to defend themselves in audit cases. Given how the FBI has been politicized and weaponized, and how the DOJ has been politicized and weaponized, we have to question whether the real purpose of these IRS agents may be to target political opponents for audits or for harassment. Contributing to this speculation is the fact that the IRS, according to the legislation that was enacted last year, would be armed and trained in shooting firearms. Why do IRS agents need to know how to do that? Also, aren't the Democrats the ones who are against people owning guns? Again, even though eliminating these 87,000 new agents will not pass the Senate, it is always a good thing to bring these measures to a vote, because at the very least, we can see, and it will be put on record, how our leaders act in these important decisions. And the third biggest agenda for the House of Representatives in these upcoming years is to investigate economic competition from China, and specifically China's intellectual property theft. Timeless is a show that reports a lot on the threat that China poses to us, but the trouble is that we have heard politicians on both sides of the aisle pledge to do these investigations for the past 25 years, and very little has come of them. So yes, I would rather have the House of Representatives talking about this issue than not talking about it, but talking about it and not doing anything about it decade after decade is quite unsatisfying. Also, the word investigation is one that has been so overused in the past decade. And it seems that we have reached a point where investigation, or proclaiming that there will be an investigation, has become not the preliminary or the predicate for an action, but actually a substitute for an action. In the 1970s and the 1980s, you rarely heard the term investigation. If something was sufficiently egregious or important, like Watergate or the Iran-Contra affair, you would hear the word hearings. Congress would hold hearings on these matters. Often the superior feature of hearings is that they are public, whereas investigations are done out of view, if they're even done at all. It raises the question with investigations, who is doing the investigating? What are they doing? Who are they interviewing? What questions are they asking? Are they asking good follow-up questions? And crucially, what is the recourse if something bad has happened? And also a downside of an investigation is that it makes it look like there are these experts and that there's a conclusion. And what's good about a hearing is that it allows the American people to be the experts and to make a conclusion. It would be great to see the Republicans in the House go back to holding hearings about the weaponization of government or about the economic competition from China instead of investigations. But we can only hope that this House will accomplish at least some of what they have outlined. Thank you for joining us today, and remember that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. See you tomorrow.